In this section, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, brain development across the first 2 years of life. This is an absolutely fascinating topic to me, and entire courses could be structured around this one very one topic. So I'm going to do my best to try to hit the highlights for you, and I strongly recommend that you check out the video links because there are also some excellent documentaries that can give you a deeper picture if this is of particular interest to you. So the brain is actually the fastest growing organ in human development. And how efficiently your brain grows over time is absolutely going to affect later cognition. The human body is actually designed in such a way that when the body faces some kind of challenge, like if you were to fall over, you are actually designed so that your head will be spared as often as possible in any kind of accident or a bad turn of events. And this phenomenon is referred to as head sparing. So usually the head is a bit larger than the rest of the body, and when you watch how infant reflexes have developed, if an infant tumbles over from crawling, usually the back head neck extension allows the head to not take on the impact. So our bodies have been designed to protect our heads. Within the brain, which as we know is encased in a skull, and that skull starts off to be a little bit softer, a little bit more flexible upon birth, and becomes increasingly hardened over time, becomes kind of better armor, but also less flexible over time. All of that is to protect this soft tissue that is so critical for who we become. Within the brain, we're going to talk about a couple of key aspects of biological development I'd like you to know. The first concept is the neuron. The neuron is, one of billions of nerve cells that are in your central nervous system. Your central nervous system is comprised of your brain, your spinal cord, and then all of the nerve fibers that extend out to gather sensory and perceptive information. The communication that happens within the central nervous system really begins with these nerve cells or neurons. Most neurons are created before birth and are at peak production at a rate of 250,000 new cells per minute in the second trimester. That's absolutely astounding. And in infancy, the human brain actually has billions of neurons that are actively making billions of connections. In fact, these connections can be a little bit hard to picture, but what you've got here are two neurons who are connecting where the axon of one, the axon is the fiber that extends from a neuron, and it's going to carry these electrochemical messages to the next neuron. So at the axon of one, think of it as like the port of one cell, is going to connect up with the port at another cell. The axon of one cell connects to what we call the dendrite of the second cell. So the dendrite is the fiber that extends from the neuron and receives the electrochemical impulses that are transmitted. Another important term to know is that while these connections, which you might think of as tangles of axons and dendrites connecting to each other, these connections are occurring all the time. Every time there's new learning, there are new connections, and that's true across the lifespan. They are also being pruned all the time. Think of pruning as editing out. And for healthy brain development, we need for connections to happen and we need for pruning to happen. And if one of those processes is not occurring in as healthy a way as it should, we can see disorders in brain development. So for example, in my area of study, autism, it's thought that it is probably not a brain condition that resides in one part of the brain. It's not like just something is wrong in your right hemisphere or your left hemisphere. Autism is thought to biologically be a disorder in the connectivity across neurons in different brain centers. So some conditions that result in this really complex interplay of behavioral and learning characteristics could at their very, very root be based in how flexible these connection systems are. And the ability for axons and dendrites to connect up is guided by genetics, and it's also guided by your experience. So your axons and your dendrites are the things that connect to each other, and every cell has axons and dendrites that are going to connect with other cells. It's also important to keep these terms in mind. Synapse, that's the term that refers to the gap or the intersection between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of the other. It's this little gap that the chemicals have to jump from one cell to the other. And these synapses are where the neurotransmitters or the brain chemicals are going to be transferred from one cell to the other. So some conditions, such as depression, could be related to problems in the efficiency of how the chemicals travel over these synapses. Another thing to keep in mind is we have something that coats our cells, kind of like insulation, that we refer to as myelin. And this coating of the axon and the cell allows for a speedy transmission of information from neuron to neuron. Your myelin, which coats each and every axons in their cell all across your body, is a very important part of neurological functioning. And it's thought that we are born with most of this intact. Over time, some degenerative illnesses can occur where it's a problem in the myelin that results in the disease. So for example, multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's have been connected to myelin-related disorders because without enough of that kind of insulation, you don't get a speedy enough nerve signal traveling from cell to cell. Another term to keep in mind is the cortex. These are the outer layers of the brain. This is the part that is closest to your skull, the outer region where most of your higher order thinking and feeling and sensing occurs. What's critical is connecting this outer layer to all of the deeper brain functions, the things that are, more towards the center of your brain, where they actually regulate things like breathing and your more core functions. To me, this is a very interesting thing that evolution has done. We know that nerve cells that are closer to the surface are at greater risk of being injured than those that are protected way deep down within the brain. So the things that you need for survival, like breathing, heart rate, respiration, those are stored very, very deep in the center of the brain, and the thought is that they are more protected from injury. Not that it's a good thing to have your higher level thoughts be affected by injury, but one can survive with problems with your cortex. You couldn't survive if you had problems with your brainstem, which is deep inside your brain. Another part of the brain I'd like you to think about, because it's so critical for child development and crucial for adult functioning, is your prefrontal cortex. So this is the area of your cortex, that thin outer layer of your brain, that is at the front of your brain, just below your forehead actually. This is where what we call executive function resides. Executive functions are kind of the master planners of the brain. It's like the coordination center or like the conductor in an orchestra. So your ability to anticipate something, to plan for something, to control your impulses, all of that is residing in the prefrontal cortex. And as we'll discuss in this class, early on in infancy and toddlerhood, the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain are not really very efficient. Therefore, we don't expect infants and toddlers to be good planners, good organizers, or to have impulse control. It isn't until the prefrontal cortex becomes fully developed that we see those attentional and regulation capacities emerge in human beings. Interestingly enough, the age where your prefrontal cortex is thought to mature is estimated to be anywhere from 18 years to 28 years, depending on the study. So if you are between that age of 18 and 28 and you're sort of wondering, why aren't I better organized? It's possible that with maturation in your late 20s, you'll feel like you get more on top of things because the connectivity in your prefrontal cortex has naturally matured. The thought is that that's an interaction between biological maturation and your experiences. The fact that the prefrontal cortex is not mature in adolescence also becomes important as we discuss issues of adolescent risk-taking, because the prefrontal cortex is there to help you make good decisions. And some have argued that things like learning how to drive at 16 don't developmentally make sense because the prefrontal cortex may not be developed well enough for a 16-year-old to know how to make good decisions while driving. So, prefrontal cortex, associate it with your executive functions, which have to do with regulation and attention. The next really important part of the brain I want you to think about is the limbic system. This is the part of your brain that creates your emotions, and it includes your fear center, which is the amygdala, the hypothalamus, which has to do with regulation, and the hippocampus, which has to do with memory. For those of you that are interested in trauma or children who have been abused or neglected, for example, what we find is that early exposure to trauma actually changes the way that your self-regulation of emotion system is tuned up. So a child who has been through some very difficult things in the early years may have an overactive amygdala, an overactive fear center. What that means is that that child, as they grow up, biologically is primed to anticipate threat more quickly and more readily than other children. And sometimes that threat is not even there. They've just picked up the smallest sign, and because their system has had to develop some safety nets, they become hypersensitive to small amounts of threat. And that can make it very difficult emotionally to deal with the challenges of growing up. Another important term of neurological development is to consider those two structures I mentioned. We'll talk about this in future lectures as well. Think of the hippocampus as being involved in memory, particularly the memory for where things are, and it also becomes important because the hippocampus is closely related to the fear system. So fears and memories are tightly tied, and it's thought that that helps us with our survival. The hypothalamus is part of that self-regulation system, as I mentioned. It creates hormones, which are basically chemicals that are going to get signals from your fear center, or the amygdala. They're going to get input from your memories, or the hippocampus, and it's the hypothalamus that then sends the signals to the rest of the body. So if the fear center gets activated and the hippocampus says, I remember that, that's truly dangerous, the hypothalamus is going to send out the hormones that say, it's time to fight or flight. We got to do something about this. It is time to panic. The hormone that the hypothalamus one of the hormones that the hypothalamus regulates is cortisol. This is a stress hormone, and its fluctuations are very, very normal throughout the day. So our cortisol naturally is low when we wake up, increases a little bit around 9:30 or 10 in the morning usually, and then also can dip in the afternoon. Your stress levels have something to do with your alertness, but there are certain rhythms throughout the day that are anticipated as normal for a human being. If a person experiences trauma, like a natural disaster, for example, like when I think about these wildfires that are hitting the West right now, if a developing child has those experiences, you're going to get some dysregulation of how much cortisol is going to be released by the hypothalamus. Chronic stress can lead to too much cortisol in the system, and that can lead to an increase in anxiety and an increase in attention problems in child development. So that is part of what helps us manage stress. I mean, cortisol really has an important survival function. It lets us know when we need to be alert so we can be ready to take care of ourselves. But if there's too much cortisol flooding the system, it can have long-term impacts on our emotional health, such that you can develop a panic disorder, for example, or have supreme fatigue because you are chronically in a state of stress and therefore kind of lose all of your energy just being revved up. Understanding this hormonal system, which starts in infancy, can be really important for helping adults who've been through trauma accept the fact that they might need medication for things like anxiety or panic. For example, when we think about post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans, one of the things that we've learned is that men in particular have been socialized often to believe that anxiety is a weakness, and if they were to experience a panic attack, that it somehow demonstrates that they're weak in character. This obviously is also the same with women, but the studies of veterans have focused primarily on male veterans up to this point. That belief that anxiety is a weakness can hold back the appropriate treatments for PTSD in a veteran. So one of the most important parts of helping an adult accept that medication could help with anxiety is to demonstrate for them that when they feel that panic or that anxiety, that's a biological system that's happening. It's not a sign of weakness. And those biological systems are strongly affected by our experiences. So while we're focused on what happens in childhood, it's important to know that across development, if we experience trauma, those hormonal chemical balance systems are going to be thrown off kilter most likely. And one of the most effective ways we have of managing it right now scientifically are with anti-anxiety medications. Those target too much of the hormones or help regulate how those hormones are carried over time. So please keep that in mind. If you have a friend or a family member, or for yourself, if you experience chronic anxiety, too much stress, if it's wearing you out, if you're constantly preoccupied by worries, that doesn't mean that there's any kind of weakness in your character. That means that your biology is trying to protect you, and it's doing it by thrusting you into that exhausting state of fight or flight way too often and way too deeply. And one of the best ways of managing that is to get a little bit of biological help, which can be through medicine. It can also be through exercise. Exercise can have remarkable impacts on anxiety. So it's not just meds that help. We usually need a biological agent like physical exertion in a certain number of minutes for a certain amount of time, and or meds and healthy sleep, in combination with some cognitive behavioral techniques, things that we learn to do with our thoughts and our behaviors that help us cope better. So I don't mean to get off track, but I want you to keep in mind that your brain and how well your stress hormones are working is going to be affected by not only your experiences as a young child, but your experiences since then. And if you're experiencing too much stress, we have scientifically proven ways to help with that. And I would encourage you to seek some assistance, because it's remarkable when your biology evens out, you also have the energy to learn better coping strategies. But it's really hard to learn something new when you're in a state of panic. And that's the same with infants and children. The other hormone I want you to know about comes from your pituitary gland. Your pituitary hormone also responds to signals from this stress system, and your pituitary gland is involved in growth. So an infant under tremendous stress may have problems with their growth. There may be some stunting that is related not to malnutrition, but to ongoing stress, such as being in a caregiver environment that isn't safe. So as you look at the brain, I want you to have just a general operating knowledge of overall structure. So for this class, I've tried to put the terms I expect you to know in these slides on basic terms. I don't expect you to know about every single part of the brain or what it does. But I would like you to have in mind a couple of general principles. The first principle being that the things that you really need for survival are deep, deep down in the center of the brain. So things like you can see here in this picture, the thalamus, that's going to relay messages between your lower brain centers like respiration and balance to your thought centers, the cortex on the outside there. I'd also like for you to know the second principle, which is that our brain is built of two hemispheres. You've got a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and then there's a bit of a crevice in between. I'd like you to know this term, the corpus callosum. Those are the axon fibers that are embedded in that crevice between the left and the right hemispheres, and they are super important for connecting up both sides of the brain. Now, by having these two lobes, what we would call a bicameral brain, a brain with two hemispheres, there's a couple of important things to keep in mind. The first is that we think that evolutionarily, this was a good way for the brain to be designed, because if one side of the brain becomes injured in healthy people, the other hemisphere can usually take over the functions that were injured and can kind of serve as a backup whole brain. So because the brain has these segmented parts, we are better able to survive if something happens to one side of the brain. The other thing to know, though, is that this ability to repair or to compensate for an injury on the other hemisphere is still understudied. We have a lot to learn about how these two hemispheres communicate with each other, or what to do when something goes wrong in one hemisphere and not the other. We've also learned more things about which hemisphere tends to drive the capacities more than another hemisphere. So interestingly enough, you've probably heard this, if you are left-handed, you probably do more processing on the right side of your brain. If you are right-handed, you tend to process things more through the left side of your brain. This is something that scientists are still trying to understand and study, why this cross-hemispheric sort of relationship occurs. There are also an awful lot of things that we do that requires that you integrate something that the left side of the brain is telling you to do and something that the right side of the brain is telling you to do. So one of the earliest features of that is when we see a child being able to bring both of their hands to the middle of their body. We call that bringing hands to midline. When you see an infant being able to coordinate both hands to their middle, that is a sign that you're beginning to get better and better connectivity between those two hemispheres. Because the right hemisphere is helping the left hand get to the middle, and the left hemisphere is helping the right hand come. So two hands at midline is something that you'll notice in developmental assessments of motor skills of infants. You want to see that skill emerging by about 8 months. And if it doesn't, it could be a soft sign that that connectivity isn't as strong as you'd like it to be. This hemispheric connectivity is another reason why early in our development, we usually don't have a preference for left or right hands. That develops over time. Another really important concept I'd like you to understand about brain development is the idea of exuberance and the idea of pruning. And I mentioned this a moment ago. So remember that the brain has billions of neurons. There are actually more neurons than you'll ever use, but you'll keep them across your lifetime until they are pruned. Newborn brains have fewer dendrites, axons, and synapses, and less myelination than the adult brain. So those neurons are there, but they haven't become fully functional. As you get this increase in dendrites, you get this increase in connectivity. And this happens during the first 2 years of life and is referred to as transient exuberance. So think of exuberance as meaning connections. You get this period of intense connectivity where dendrites are being developed and they can accept what the axons have to say. And this exuberance that happens in the second year of life is followed by a period of pruning. So between the age of 2 and 3, the brain should be actively involved in editing out too many connections so that we can get to some efficient pathways. When you have unused dendrites, it creates these opportunities for more synapses to occur, which leads to more opportunities for neurochemicals to jump from cell to cell, which actually leads to more complex thinking. So while we want a lot of connections to happen, we also want the infant brain to develop a lot of dendrites that are waiting for an axon. It's kind of like saying, put this thought here, let me grow into some complex thinking. So brain development is rapid, it's complex, it occurs across our lifetime, but this exuberant period in the second year of life is really important for later cognition. In addition to these chemical and biological changes, your experiences also actively shape the brain. And there are two kinds of experiences that since the 2000s, scientists have really been paying attention to as they look at how the human brain changes over time. So there's a scientist named Greenaw and colleagues who were absolutely instrumental in helping us come to these understandings. So let me try to tell you about a couple examples of these two different ways that experience impacts the brain. The first is called experience expectant brain function. This is where almost all infants are expected to have these experiences. It includes things like being held, being bonded, being able to have visual stimuli in your world, hearing sounds, the sorts of things that you would expect a healthy infant to be able to have access to. If a baby doesn't have access to these experiences, the baby's brain will not develop. So imagine, for example, a baby who is severely neglected, maybe not attended to after birth for several hours, or left somewhere, maybe a fire station, and isn't located for several hours. During that time, the baby is not getting what he or she needs relationally, socially, biologically, and without those experiences, certain parts of the brain are not going to be able to develop as well. So the metaphor for experience expectant brain function is just like a tree needs water, is how an infant's brain needs bonding, which attachment to a responsive caregiver. They need to have a feeling of safety and warmth. They need access to movement, and they need access to stimulation. Without those things, the brain will not develop. Experience-dependent brain function has to do with experiences that not all infants are expected to have. But if you do have them, your development is going to be impacted in a particular way. And sometimes this is a good way, and sometimes it's a bad way. So if a child were to be born in an area where there is famine, for example, and the baby has the experience of severe malnutrition and drought, that's going to have a very particular impact on a negative impact on brain development. If, on the other hand, a baby has a particularly enriched experience, so for example, in the early years hears 3 different languages all the time in their home, they may develop certain brain connections that infants without that experience wouldn't have. So one of the ways to think about how experience shapes the brain is to think about results from language development studies. So if you were to, as your text describes, compare and contrast animals and babies, we find that human babies learn language very much like birds learn songs. We have birds, for example, inherit genes that tell their brain cells sort of what new songs to expect and kind of recognize. It's the same, we think, with human babies. We're sort of born with an expectancy of a certain architecture of communication, and therefore we kind of come into the world, it's thought, with this structure that then, if we are able to be exposed to language, our brains will grow that way. So as adults talk to babies, the baby's brain is already ready to hear that and is ready to grow. It's thought that even while the baby is in utero, that the baby can hear sounds around him or her, and that the quality of the sounds that the baby hears, the language that's around the baby, is going to very specifically prime the brain. So a baby who is while the mom is pregnant, she's in China listening to Chinese all the time. The language structures of the Chinese language are going to be readily mapped onto that baby's brain when he or she is born. If the family were to then move to a place where English is the most common language, early in our development, our brains are what we would call plastic. They're flexible enough to be able to take that architecture that was built for Chinese and now make it helpful for learning English. But early on, those architectures are influenced by what's around us. Isn't that amazing? And the fact that our cells would carry that and grow with that is just astounding. And it turns out this is very similar to what happens in the animal kingdom. In order for these dendrites and neurons to connect up in a certain way, not only do you need those biological kind of foundations, but the baby birds need to be able to have the experience of hearing those songs in order to fully develop their bird language. So, in conclusion, brain development is a huge topic. It's a fascinating topic to me. There's so much to cover. And the things that I'd like you to know is that in the first 2 years of life, brain development is a really important part of child development. And creating a healthy environment will help to create a healthy infant brain. So we have to make sure that infants have enough stimulation, enough play, enough social connections, and enough emotional support when they're dysregulated in order to grow up to be healthy human beings. Thank you for your attention.